And then around the turn of the second millennium, around 2000, we get a convergence of satellite communications, robotics, precision-guided munitions, the ability to put it all together in a single package, which, was the Predator, MQ-1 Predator. And the first time I saw this thing, I was forward deployed, and I think we only had 2 or 3 of them in the inventory at the time, and nobody knew that they were armed. And I saw them flying with Hellfires on them, trying to hunt for bin Laden right after 9/11. And I was like, wow, I can't believe we have this capability.
This month, Wayne Phelps joins the podcast. Mr. Phelps is a retired Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel who deployed 5 times, including 2 deployments to Afghanistan, 2 deployments to Iraq, and 1 deployment aboard a U.S. Navy ship. He was amongst the first conventional troops on the ground in Pakistan after 9/11. He also participated in the initial invasion into Iraq in 2003 and the troop surge into Afghanistan in 2010. He commanded units at every level, from platoon to squadron, serving as an instructor at the Marine Corps' premier aviation training squadron, and served as a staff officer in the Pentagon. In 2014, he was selected to become a drone pilot, and he attended the Air Force's remotely piloted aircraft undergraduate training, becoming the first Marine honor graduate. His last assignment was as the commanding officer of Marine Unmanned Aerial Vehicle Squadron 3 in Kaneohe Bay, Hawaii. As the commanding officer, he deployed 4 teams to conduct counter-terrorism operations against violent extremist organizations. He holds a master's degree in military studies and a bachelor's degree in mathematics. His personal military decorations include the Bronze Star, 2 Meritorious Service Medals, 3 Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medals, 1 with Combat V for Valor, a Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, Combat Action Ribbon, Honorable Order of St. Barbara, and 2012 Marine Corps Aviation Association Command and Control Officer of the Year. He is also the author of the book on Killing Remotely, The Psychology of Killing with Drones. He currently resides in Austin, Texas, with his wife and 2 children.
And welcome Wayne Phelps to the podcast. Thank you so much, Wayne, for coming on.
Kervin, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk with you today.
Yeah, I saw you on LinkedIn. I think someone was promoting the book on Killing Remotely. I think it was because it was added to the Navy War College, or it was added to the reading list of one university.
Well, it's been added to the Air Force Academy's UAS program, kind of suggested reading list. That was one. And then Space Command senior enlisted leader, Master Gunnery Sergeant Stalker, has put it on his reading list as well. So,
that is awesome. So would you like to give a background of yourself, who you are, and how you got to writing the book on Killing Remotely?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a retired Marine. Spent 20 years. Spent 20 years in the service. Retired in 2018. I started off as an air defense officer, so working Stinger missiles, kind of the standard platoon commander, battery commander, things like that within the battalion. And there was never an air threat during my time because I came in the late 90s, commissioned in 97, pre 9/11, and then after 9/11, we're fighting in countries where there's really no air threat. So I did a lot of provisional infantry kind of missions, guarding bases, convoys, patrols, those sorts of things. My first combat deployment was on 9/11. I was actually forward deployed on a ship in Darwin, Australia. And then, when the attacks happened, we sent the ship and all the Marines over towards Pakistan and actually into Afghanistan. So the first conventional troops on the ground during that conflict. I came back and then picked up battery command and almost immediately started training the battery to go to war in Iraq. And then I deployed as part of the initial invasion in Iraq in 2003 as a battery commander, leading about 150 Marines, and then came back again in 2004. And I did half a deployment at that point because I was selected for school, did school. And then I went off to the Marine Corps' Aviation and Weapons and Tactics Squadron to be an instructor. Then back to school for a master's, and then back to be a battalion executive officer. We deployed to Afghanistan as part of the surge in 2010, and then I did another deployment on a ship. spent some time in the Pentagon. And then at that point, I started working on drones, on UAS, right? Unmanned aircraft systems. I was working the programmatic and budgeting side of the house and requirements, and I really enjoyed it. And I said, I'm going to throw my name in the hat and see if they'll select me for this. And there was a new occupation that was opening up at the time. Ended up getting approved and selected and went to the Air Force's remotely piloted aircraft training pipeline. Became the first Marine honor grad for the course, which seems impressive, but I was a major at the time competing against second lieutenants. So I feel like I had a little bit of a leg up.
And what year was this?
That was in 2014 when I went through the pipeline. And then after that, I went to Hawaii for 4 years, my last 4 years in service, to a squadron that flies drones. And after 2 years there, I became the commanding officer of the unit. And then we supported operations overseas for 24 of the 26 months that I was in command. So fighting violent extremists, using drones to fight them, and then bringing in other assets to strike them, either artillery or manned aircraft. So that's really what prompted me to look into how people are responding to this kind of work. I was getting towards the end of my career. It was April of 2018, and I've always had this idea that I wanted to write a book, and I pitched an idea to Dave Grossman. Dave Grossman, who wrote On Killing and On Combat, and I said, "Hey, I want to take all the work that you've done and like On Killing, and look at it through the lens of drones, right? Like how people respond to this kind of work when they are 7,000 miles away, but they're looking at things on a screen and zoomed in, high definition, watching people for a long period of time. And I think there's something there that needs to be explored and studied." And he was like, I never expected to hear back from him. Obviously, it was a cold pitch on, you just reached out to him, and he wrote back and was like, "That's a great idea. Let's do it." And at that point, I said, "Wow, okay, what do I do now?" I was the dog that caught the car at that point. So he was a great mentor. He kind of guided me through the process. We created a survey where we surveyed 254 service members across all positions in remotely piloted aircraft, intelligence analysts, sensor operators, pilots, those kinds of things, and all branches of service, and even some of our foreign allies, like the Brits, participated in the survey. And the one thing that I really needed to get to the heart of was people that had actually used drones to kill the enemy. And that could be anything from, "Hey, I found the enemy and I called it in." So there's a little bit of an accountability factor there. They feel like they're responsible for the strike. Or I actually employed ordnance from my own drone, fired a missile. So those are the people that I really wanted to survey. And after that, I conducted over 50 first-person interviews to really add a quantitative nature of the study. I think that's a long answer to a question.
That's a great answer. And so right where you left off is kind of where I want to pick up, because in combat, a lot of times we think of, the what we would call in the Army the grunts, or, the Marine Corps as a whole, going out and just face to face with the enemy, and you fire upon the enemy from your weapon and see the other person die or run away. And now we've gotten into, just like your book On Killing Remotely does a great job on the history of weapons and how we've come from sort of that spear into somebody's, chest, to cruise missiles flying off, hundreds of miles away into a location, and now drones that can be flown thousands of miles away, and now you're flying overhead and you're hitting munitions onto the enemy, and you're having to watch that. So I'd like to ask you where you think we are right now in sort of the mental health portion of that sort of killing. I got out in 2015, so from there, have you seen the military do anything different that is helping those guys who feel as if they took actions in their own hands, even though it's remotely, and they're having a difficult time with that?
Yeah, a lot of great points there. So let me first address the evolution of weapons that you talked about. I spent the entire first chapter just kind of laying out how it's our nature, our tendency when we develop weapons to try to make them more accurate, but at the same time, try to make the user safer by increasing the physical distance between combatants, between the killer and the person that's being killed. And you see that with, starts off, and I go way back in the book, right? Starts off with, hey, it's a stone, right? So you got people fist fighting, and then one person picks up a stone, and it's like, well, I can hit you from a little distance. And then I just trace that evolution of weapons through archers and bows and guns, missiles, rockets, satellites, which give us the ability to do precision guided munitions and lasers, the combination of all of those things. And then around the turn of the second millennium, around 2000, we get a convergence of satellite communications, robotics, precision guided munitions, the ability to put it all together in a single package, which, was the Predator, MQ-1 Predator. And the first time I saw this thing, I was forward deployed, and I think we only had 2 or 3 of them in the inventory at the time, and nobody knew that they were armed. And I saw them flying with Hellfires on them, trying to hunt for bin Laden right after 9/11. And I was like, wow, I can't believe we have this capability. So I would go in, and the launch and recovery crew, I'd watch the video feed, and then I'd watch them hand it off to pilots back in the United States. And it just blew my mind that we had this capability to fly a tactical mission from the other side of the planet. It was crazy. So that was 2001.
So that was over 20 years ago.
Yeah. You got out in 2015.
Yes.
And over the course of about 20 years, the enterprise within the Air Force has only exponentially grown to the point now where the Air Force trains more drone pilots than it does manned pilots. I was just speaking at a graduation yesterday for the newest 24 drone pilots in the Air Force, and that's the 3rd graduation that I've been to this year. It's only March, and each one of those classes is just churning them out. I think they're about 8 or 9 classes in so far. It's crazy the amount of drone pilots we're training. So your question was, do you think that we have improved the mental health and the tools for these folks doing this mission? And I would say yes and no. There's an Air Force psychologist named Dr. Wayne Chappell who's done a lot of research over the last decade, published lots of papers on this topic. He's probably the first person that initially documented that PTSD occurs for RPA aircrew and intelligence analysts. Initially, I want to say it was 2014, he assessed it at about 4.3% of the people that he looked at had PTSD-like symptoms. A few years later, he conducted another similar survey and found that about 6.1% of the people surveyed experienced PTSD-like symptoms. So the Air Force particularly is aware of the problem. They have implemented these things called human performance teams that are supposed to be embedded in remotely piloted aircraft squadrons. They have a clearance. They're supposed to be there to help. They could talk about mission-specific things, what happened, what went wrong, how are you feeling about it, all that kind of stuff. That was implemented after Chappell's, first survey, and then the second survey showed higher numbers of PTSD. I don't know if there's a correlation between the two, that maybe people feel more comfortable about their own mental health now that they can seek help and they get, the number goes up.
Yeah, that was going to be my question.
Yeah.
Because I can tell you from my time, I was at Bragg starting in 2009 when ramping up their program out there. And I know early on the way I felt when I heard, the guys, the sensor operators or the pilots who would complain about having issues or PTSD, and I would pretty much, what the military says, shut up and color. Tell them, just shut up, guys. It's not that big of a deal. But as I've grown and gotten out and reflected on all of that, I've kind of changed my opinion on it and how mental health is very key in keeping not only these guys in uniform, but continuing the job without destroying their lives.
Yeah. Well, it's counterintuitive to think that somebody sitting in a box in the safety of the United States that's flying a combat mission on the other side of the planet should have any sort of mental issues with the work that they're doing, right? It's counterintuitive for you and I to think that, and we were in the service, So it's definitely hard for civilians to think like, well, why would you even be bothered by that? And I want to just touch on a couple of points. First, there's been lots of research done on content moderators. And I talked about this in the book a little bit, but I just heard another story yesterday on NPR about TikTok moderators and how they're still suffering from some of these things. So content moderators are these humans that are employed by social media companies like Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube, all of those folks. They're employed to keep the worst content that people attempt to post off the internet, right? So they have algorithms that'll do the first screening and they'll send it over to a human. And a human is like, okay, you're looking at things like murders, rapes, beheadings, pornography, racism, just the worst of humanity, or that people are attempting to post online. And you have a human, after the algorithm, sends it over to say yes or no, make the decision. The human has to do the screening of it, and they get about 25 seconds to look at it and make a yes or no decision, and then move on to the next one. And they have a quota. Each day they've got to hit their quota, and it's just crazy. Like most of these people that you hear about are not doing well, right? They're suffering from some sort of traumatic experiences from the things that they're observing, even though they're in no physical danger. They're not in harm's way. They're just seeing this deluge of just horrible stuff happening, right? And I think that's one extreme, because that's like every 25 seconds, something else bad is happening. And that's how you spend your entire day. That's going to mess somebody up. What makes the PTSD diagnosis actually possible for RPA crews and intelligence analysts is the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of Mental Health, otherwise known as the DSM. The DSM-5 is the latest edition. It came out in 2013. The DSM is considered the Bible by mental health professionals. It's their go-to. In 2013, there was a few updates to kind of the precursors for PTSD, the things that these conditions have to be met in order for someone to fall into the category of a diagnosis of PTSD. And they removed one thing as well, in which I think is very important. They removed the fact that a person had to fear for their own life or their own safety, right? So leading up to this, that was kind of you were in a car accident, or someone was, trying to murder you, or you were being shot at in the line of duty, things like that. You feared for your life, and that would, be a precursor to a PTSD diagnosis. They removed that. That precursor no longer exists in there.
That seems huge.
Yeah, that is huge. And I don't know if they had the drone crews in mind, or if they were thinking of content moderators or what, but I think they were around that time, we were starting to see more and more people that were having these traumatic experiences from doing work remotely, right? Whether it was killing with a drone or looking at social media content, things like that. It was crazy. The other thing that's important to note is within the DSM-5, they added another thing that says, and I'm forgetting the actual term for it, but they added in another line that said, if screen trauma was a thing, as long as it happened in the line of duty, right? So, and what that means is, observing horrific, traumatic, things occurring on a screen.
Now that makes a lot of sense to me, because I lived that life, for 15 years. But if you don't mind explaining the process of you have the pilot, you have the sensor operator, you have what's called an ISR, tactical controller, that's across in the country that the drone is flying. And all these guys are looking at screens. And if you don't mind, if you can break down sort of that process and who has seen what and what's actually going on.
Okay. So you have the actual air crew, where you've got a pilot and a sensor operator. The pilot flies the aircraft. The sensor operator moves the camera, zooms in the camera, all of those kinds of things. But both the pilot and the sensor operator can be looking at the camera feed at any given time, because the pilot is also the one, at least with the Reaper, the pilot's the one that that fires the missile, right? And the sensor,
exactly, yeah.
And the sensor operator is the one that guides the missile onto the target. So that's the air crew. Then you have intelligence analysts. You have the ISR tactical controller, like you talked about, who can, and also sometimes referred to as a mission intelligence controller or coordinator.
Yeah, it's gone back and forth. I know even when I was in, they would go, it's a coordinator or a controller, and sort of in the military, words mean things.
Yeah. So it's basically a person that's sitting on the crew that is helping to analyze from an intelligence perspective of the legitimacy of the target. They're helping to positively identify that it's a valid military target for striking. They're also helping with determining collateral damage. If we strike this target from here, what's the blast going to look like? What's going to be the damage to, collateral structures? And are we going to kill any sort of civilians based off this blast, frag pattern and things like that? So and then the ISR tactical controller is connected to this huge enterprise of intelligence analysts who are also viewing the same video. And sometimes you could have lawyers that are called in to view, and the whole crew, between the people flying, the intelligence analysts, the lawyers, commanders, even the commanders in the field that you're supporting can be looking at your video feed, and everyone can be chatting back and forth. So it's a bunch of people that are dispersed, all looking at the same video, trying to coordinate actions on an objective of what they're trying.
Yeah. And so, with that, we're talking about mental health and about specifically putting munitions on the ground into a person and destroying that person's life. But then there's also, and I'd like to get your comments on this, because I also think there is this sort of process where the intelligence side chooses is not a good term, but validates a enemy combatant or a terrorist is in a certain location, and you see that person moving around, and you only have, whether it's seconds or just minutes, for that whole process you talked about to all come together and be approved, and then munitions go down. And that sort of, to me as well, brings up sort of these PTSD, mental health issues, as the stressor of that situation, where if you don't make this happen, there are going to be some stars, some generals, or some senators that are going to be asking questions about why this didn't happen or why it went wrong.
Yeah, the pressure on the crews to constantly strike targets is enormous, and it's at pretty high levels too, all the way up to the commander in chief sometimes, based off of different targets, right? So if a target is a high enough priority, and let's take an instance like Qasem Soleimani, general from the Iranian Republican Guard. I think I got that correct. But he was basically yeah. So we killed him in Iraq in 2020, I believe. I think it was January of 2020. Killed him outside the Baghdad airport with a missile. That kind of target is going to go all the way up to the highest levels, right? That's going to be a presidential authorization for somebody of that importance. Anwar al-Awlaki, a U.S. citizen killed in Yemen.
Yeah, I worked that mission, actually.
Yeah.
So it's funny. It's funny you bring it up, because that may have been one of the most stressful missions for us as a team.
Yeah. And that's another one, right? Because you're trying to get over the hurdle on the legal side of killing an American citizen overseas without due process, which is strictly prohibited in the Constitution. So this is still being debated today. I think we've killed 8 U.S. citizens in drone strikes that I've found in open sources. And out of those 8, only 1 was deliberately targeted. Like, that was the nature of the target. The other 7 were inadvertently killed because they were surrounded by, a target we were trying to go after. But al-Awlaki was the only U.S. citizen that we were deliberately trying to kill. Now, whether he deserved to be killed, whether we had the legal standing to kill him, and whether it was the right thing to do, those are all debates that we could spend hours talking about.
Yeah, I don't think we'll get to that on on this podcast, and
No.
I would say I'm not the one to be talking on that. So you have more experience than I do in that sort of realm.
Yeah, and I only bring that up to say that these are if the president calls, because you got a phone sitting there when you're flying, the president, calls and like, hey, Kervin, you're cleared hot to kill Soleimani. And you're like, okay, thanks, Mr. President, missiles away. Yeah, you don't get that in other weapons platforms, other manned aircraft. You don't have that same level of interaction. And you don't know the direct line to those approving authorities. So there's this huge pressure. And then also the amount of conflict we've been involved in. I've talked to people that have had 9 strikes in a week. They're flying thousands upon thousands of hours. Most people I talked to out of the ones I surveyed had been part of 50 or more strikes in their life, in their career. So I had this notion that the most, all of these strikes, like people that have had more than 50 strikes, that's going to have some sort of, quantitative impact on them. Like once you get past 50 and beyond, like that's just so much for a person to handle. And that was my thesis initially, or that was my hypothesis, I'm sorry. After conducting some research and interviews and the surveys, that's not the case. It's not the amount of strikes that you conduct. It's really the nature of the strikes. Like you could have 100 good strikes and be completely fine, or you could have one bad strike and you're just, you can't shake it.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I also think, and I'd like to know if in your communication with people, if they mention this kind of stuff, the aftermath of the strike, there's always, and I know for myself, and I think every person going through it has that initial reaction of celebration. We did it. We got the guy. And then immediately after that, oh my goodness, did we do the right thing? Did I do something beneficial, or did I just mess up someone's entire life?
Yeah, especially people that are in the intelligence community, the guys like you that did this, where you feel responsible because someone else is acting on the information you're providing, right? So you feel accountable for it. I almost think that intelligence analysts, between ISR tactical controllers and the folks at this enterprise, I almost think that they're struggling with this a little bit worse than the drone crews. And a drone pilot, captain in the Air Force, who'd recently read the book, he asked me why. Why do I think that is? And I think that's a great question, because for one thing, my sample of intelligence analysts compared to the sample of drone crew, pilots, sensor operators was a lot smaller. So there could be some bias in the sample. Another thing is, the training that you receive in the RPA pipeline, I think prepares you, like it's inevitable you're going to be part of a strike. Some intelligence folks I've talked to were like, I was picking out targets for strike packages for F-15s, and now I'm a full motion video analyst and I'm watching guys getting blown up in real time. In high definition.
And, yeah. I know in some cases, zooming into body parts just to make sure that person was who the intelligence analyst said it was, or who the sort of other pilot or the sensor operator said, yes, I followed that person. I know 100% that's who that is. So yeah, I don't know if I say that the intelligence analysts are more so, but I do think it's kind of on the same lines. I mean, I had to wait to get out to think about this and kind of reflect on it and go, you actually killed people. It was your information that killed these people, and you have to deal with that. And there's a few ways to deal with it, honestly. Yeah. Drugs and alcohol is one way, not a good way, but that's how people still to this day try to solve that issue. But I think I like where this episode's actually going. It's not really going where I kind of wanted it to, but the mental health issue I think is very, very, very important in this entire thing.
Oh, it absolutely is. So I determined that there were 3 incidents that would occur during a mission that were most likely to cause what I called a negative response to killing. And the survey determined that there was a spectrum of responses ranging from positive to neutral to negative. And by positive, I don't mean you're standing up and high-fiving and cheering, although that does occur.
Yeah, it happens, in the jock or whatever, wherever you're at.
It does, and it's not in celebration of the fact that we just killed somebody. It's in celebration of, hey, we worked hard on this, and this is going to save lives in the end. And that person was being targeted for a reason, Yeah.
I mean, could you imagine if you're at AT&T headquarters and somebody said, "Hey, I just killed this person," and everybody got up and high-fived each other?
Yeah, it's the strangest.
But that's the military for you.
Yeah, strangest context for celebration, but it happens. We're professional warriors, and that's what we're trained to do, to kill when it's necessary and required. So 3 incidents, you get your positive. The neutral is just, hey, I'm kind of ambivalent. I'm just doing my job. It doesn't affect me one way or another. And then your negative responses are things that are basically straight out of the DSM-5 from PTSD-like symptoms, anxiety, fear, loss of drive to do anything, anger, you name it. You think of them all, it's in there. And the vast majority of folks had positive to neutral responses, right? Like 85% of them weren't affected the majority of the time. And around 15 to 30 that had some sort of negative response. I really wanted to dive into that, and I wanted to understand why they're having a negative response, what caused it. And a negative response could be short-term or it could be long-term. If it's persistent long-term, then that's where it moves into the realm of PTSD. A lot of folks will have an initial negative response of like, I can't believe I just killed somebody, but then it subsides over time and there's no, long-lasting effects. 3 missions or 3 incidents that occurred, conducting what we call pattern of life missions. So watching an individual for a very, long extended period of time.
So days, weeks, months.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Forever, it seems.
Depends on, the target, because you might just be gathering additional intel on who they meet with and, trying to figure out their network so you can bring them all down. It's almost like police work.
Yeah, it is a lot like sort of a detective or investigator who's just casing a joint or just sitting outside waiting for something to happen. Intelligence analysis, as I explain it, is always, I say it's just like a detective. You're trying to get information and make a decision on that information.
So watching this person for a long period of time, which enables you to see the humanity of the person, because you're seeing things that they do that normal people do that you can relate to.
Yeah, like you see I've seen it before. A kid comes up and hugs them and they're playing and they look like everyday human beings. And you're being told, no, that's the most evil guy in that area.
Yeah. And especially during a counterinsurgency fight, they're not wearing a uniform. Just the uniform itself is like, okay, they're wearing a uniform, I'm going to kill that guy. That's the bad guy. But if you see a guy walking around in board shorts and flip flops and he's wearing a hat and his daughter's hugging him, you're like, that's the guy? Like, yeah, he's evil. So there has to be so much trust in the system of all the other intelligence that's coming to you from other sources that says, yes, that's a legitimate target. And then, you'll watch this person do some of these things. And occasionally there might be some sort of nefarious activity that you see them do. And you're like, aha, okay. And then you find the time when it's right to strike that target. And, maybe you do it in front of his family. Maybe you don't. It's all of those things have happened. And then you got to watch the family run and, see them mourn. And, or sometimes you'll kill that individual in a different location. And then you'll watch all the way back through the funeral, so you'll still get to see the family mourn. All of these situations that no other weapons system or platform does, right? An F-16 doesn't drop a bomb and then be like, okay, we need you to stick around for the funeral. And they're like, yeah, man, I don't have enough gas for that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. When you talk about things like cruise missiles or mortar fire, those guys are not watching and waiting for the family to come so that they can follow them to the funeral, like you said. It does not happen.
So that's the first one, pattern of life, recognizing the humanity. The second one is anytime there are friendly forces on the ground that we're supposed to be protecting that get wounded or killed in action. There's a lot of folks that say that, drone crews are disengaged, that they're not into the fight because they're remote, and we make it too easy to kill, and we make it like playing a video game, and that they're not connected. And my studies and research and talking with folks, this is the opposite. These people are absolutely engaged. They're in the fight. And when the people that they're protecting get wounded or killed, they feel probably some survivor's guilt and some responsibility of, I could have done more, or what could I have done to prevent that from happening? So that doesn't even have to do with striking a target, but that's a thing that happens during a mission that affects people. And then the third thing is anytime that there's civilian casualties, it doesn't matter if it's deliberate civilian casualties, which I'll talk about here in a second, or, kind of inadvertent civilian casualties. So let's talk about the civilian casualties that occur inadvertently. We don't intend to kill anyone other than the target, but occasionally people move into the objective area, into the target area as the missiles in flight, or, bombs are away.
Yeah, I guess we should say, it takes, depending on how far up the drone is, it takes a certain amount of time to go from off the rails to...
Yeah, there's a time of flight, and then there's, we typically, if somebody moves into the area that we see on our video, and you're zooming in and zooming out, or you have somebody that's overhead that's also doing a far collateral, and you're doing near, if somebody moves into that picture, you can, if there's enough time, you can shift cold, right? You can move the missile to a different location where it's not going to kill someone. That's better than, a miss where no one dies is better than killing the target and a bunch of civilians that you didn't plan on. So that happens. But if it's too close, you're talking about a missile going fast, and if it gets too close, sometimes, kinematically you can't move the missile off the target. So that's how sometimes civilian casualties occur. A situation is where we deliberately cause civilian casualties because the nature of the target is of such military value or gain that it's acceptable to have a few civilian casualties. And this sounds horrible to say, but it's not against the law of war or the rules of engagement. There's nothing illegal about it.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of collateral damage that is acceptable.
Yeah.
In those situations, depending, just like you said, depending on the level of target. If it's a high value target, the only time that we've seen this person out of their house in 20 years, and it's today, that decision does get made. I've been on that side of that. So yeah, that's a great point.
But those are some like morally challenging things that you're dealing with, right? It's the whole like trolley going down a hill, and you can save 10 people, but you have to kill one person or something like that, right? Like, if you kill this one individual that we've been trying to kill for 2 years, and, oh, by the way, you probably kill his daughter and son that happen to be, and his wife. And, if you kill them, then that will prevent, 10 attacks, next month or something, right? It's all, some of it's hypothetical of the gain. But these kinds of individuals, we're talking about the approval authority, can still go all the way up to the president, or, Secretary of Defense. So yes, depending on the collateral damage you expect to occur. So you might get a call or approval that says, hey, this is the president. You are cleared to engage, that target. HVI number 1, high value individual number 1. That's the guy we've been trying to kill for the last 10 years. I'd say it was bin Laden back in 2010. If we found him someplace, how many people would we risk killing if we could kill bin Laden in a strike? That's an emotional decision too, because most Americans would be like, 50, 10, I don't know, right? Because it's bin Laden, right?
And each person, I think, each citizen of the United States would have a different number.
Yeah.
Yeah. You'd say 100,000 would be fine if 100,000 people died, because that would save millions.
Yeah.
Yeah, sort of like the atom bomb, when that was dropped, those guys dealt with the exact same thing their entire lives.
Yeah.
Just how many people did you kill to stop a war that could have gone on for much longer?
Yeah. Versus how many people did you save or, prevent from dying on both sides, because the Japanese never would have surrendered, and we would have had to invade the mainland, and it would have been bloody. And so those are the kinds of questions that this community is facing. And here's the final point I want to make on that, Kervin, is you might have the president or SecDef or, some combatant commander within the chain of command making the decision, yes, I accept that level of collateral damage, go kill them. But they're not the ones that have to carry it out. They're not the ones that have to necessarily watch the strike. They're not the ones that have to feel that same level of accountability as the intelligence analyst, the sensor operator, and the pilot. So there's this feeling that they have to carry with them the rest of their days of knowing that they have killed people that were civilians.
Yeah, and I think the military has come a long way in allowing those kind of people, especially when you're getting into this community, the intelligence community, the RPA, the UAS community, where it's, pretty much everyone has top secret. They have all the various compartmentalized little things at the end, SCI, all that kind of stuff. And if you go to, it was when I first got in, if you go to a mental health person, that's a red flag, and your clearance could get taken away depending on what that mental health professional said about you.
Yeah.
And I think since then, now that was like 2000, and we're talking 2022 now, it's been there's been huge progress on that in telling people that there's not a stigma to that mental health anymore.
Well, openly we say there's not a stigma, right?
Right.
amongst warriors, I think there still is a little bit of a stigma, and it's
wait past that.
Well, I think we have to normalize those talks with mental health professionals, with peers. I laid out 3 things that happen during a mission where you're most likely to have a negative response. And rather than saying it's up to you if one of those 3 things happens during your mission, it's up to you if you want to go seek help. I think we take that out of your control and say, if something like this happens, you have to go seek help, right? So we're no longer the bad guy, or, we're the bad guy. I'm sorry. The institution is the bad guy in making you seek help. And the individual is like, oh man, they're making me go talk to the wizard, So, and I don't know if that's a term they use in other services, and I just find it funny. So
yes,
I'm
that's
sorry.
What we probably can't mention on here.
Yeah. But the point of that is we have to normalize that we know that these things cause negative effects on people. So let's not give them the choice to manage their own mental health. Let's get them help right away. And let's look at them and talk to them in increments, right after it occurs, a week later, 2 weeks later, a month, 6 months, you got to check in, because you process things at different times. Like sometimes you don't have time to reflect on this until you take the uniform off. And what do you do then? I spend a lot of time talking with veterans that have done this kind of work. They were fine all the way up to the point where they took the uniform off and had time to reflect on things. And now that they have had time, they're like, oh man, that was crazy. I can't believe I did that for so long, or that was the work that I had to do. And now it's there.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it gets to the point where you sort of repress that sort of information, and then the uniform comes off, and that's a big part of someone's career. It was a big part of my career. I bet a whole paycheck, it was a huge part of your career is your military career. And once that uniform comes off, you have time to reflect. And wow, this 15, 20, 25 years, what did I do?
Yeah.
And that's the point where those memories come flooding back, and you have to you start to have an existential crisis and try to figure out where you stand in civilization.
Yeah. The second point I wanted to make on that was, if you go and seek mental health help and you're removed from operations, that means, there's no just like bench of, 10 deep people waiting to get called in to play the game, right? There's just enough, or usually a little less than what we need to do operations. And if you're removed from that starting lineup, then that means that your peers have to work that much harder to make up for your absence, regardless of what position you're in, whether it's intelligence analyst or sensor operator or pilot. And the missions have to get done, right? They're required. There's no like canceling the mission because, Kervin didn't show up for work today. He must be sick. Okay, well, let's cancel that line. Like, no, this person's going to cover 2 now.
Yeah, that happens a lot. I'm glad you brought that up, because running 2-3 lines as an analyst, and then a pilot. If a pilot goes down, there's not much left. You've got crew rest. You've got a limited number of RPA or UAS pilots. So that now becomes, I was going to run an 8-hour flight. Now it's going to 10 to 12 hours, and then the next person comes in who did a 12-hour now has to do it.
Yeah, and there could be people on the other side of the planet in a fight that are counting on that drone being overhead to either provide surveillance or to provide strike capabilities. And if that's not there, then you're making their lives more dangerous. Or on the flip side, because we're not very judicious about how many sorties we fly and how they're tasked. We just have we need 70 combat air patrols, and that's the number. And we never reduce the number because requirements or operations subside. It just keeps going up and up and up, which continues to put more pressure on the system. And what I mean by that is combat air patrol. Imagine a drone flying an orbit over a specific geographic location for 24 hours a day in support of whoever owns that territory. And by owns, a military commander who's responsible for it. That number, if you remember when I said I saw the first 2 or 3 Predators, 2001, that would have been able to form probably 1 combat air patrol. And now we're to the point where you've got almost, I want to say it's 70 open source, 70 active combat air patrols around the globe.
Yeah, some of those systems can fly 18 to 20 hours, and then going 18 to 20 hours, next one's up, and it's just a continuous 24/7. What we like to call the all-seeing eye of the drone. Yeah,
that's where we are today, right? I think there's things that we could do to reduce the requirement. We could look at, do we really need this many combat air patrols all the time for each combatant commander? If we could provide a little bit of relief, then that provides more relief on the line squadrons, the people that are providing intelligence for them. The more relief you get, the more opportunities you get to take care of your own mental health and to take time off, right? So it has this cascading effect of it's just constant pressure right now. And we didn't talk about this, but there's no dwell time. My deployments, I went into country, I came home, I took some time off. There's no dwell time for people that are fighting remotely. You go and do a combat mission every time you go to work, and then you come home.
Yeah, it's not, hey, I'm deploying. You do 4 months, however long it is, 12 to 20 hours a day. And then you come back home, like you said, and it's not, well, let me go back to being a janitor. It's, well, let me go back to doing exactly what I was doing deployed, but just now at home.
Yeah. Yeah. And then anytime you're at home, you're balancing 2 worlds, the home world and the work world. And everyone, I'm sure, can relate to this. You've got these competing taskers sometimes, like, your spouse will call you at work and be like, hey, I need you to do this. You're like, but I'm working on this stuff. And you're like, it doesn't matter to me. Here's what you need to do. So you have these competing requirements. When you're forward deployed, you sever the home requirements, right? You're focused on the mission. You're downrange. You're just focused on doing your job.
Yeah, and you see a lot of guys would rather be deployed because of that situation.
Exactly. And what we have going on with the RPA community is that they're deploying to combat every day, and then they're deploying home every day. And then that's part of the struggle. And you have these things that happen on on your mission. And then, 2 hours later, you're sitting with your family at dinner, or you're driving around the city, and it's just surreal. Last thing that's horrible, I want to touch on this. I don't know how much time you have, but sleep is super important to our mental well-being, and doing shift work and shifting your sleep cycle in tight consecutive, blocks, like every 6 weeks, going from days to nights and then back, is one of the worst things that we could do to people. And I think that's a fairly easy fix. Like, hey, you're the new guy. Guess what? You got the worst shift for the first year you're here. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. Like, seniority has its privileges, as they say in the military.
Yeah, but that, I get it's the crap night shift. No one wants to do that. No one wants to be away from their family from 5:30 in the evening till 5:30 in the morning. But if you're doing that for a year, you can kind of adjust your schedule. When you're doing it, like you said, like we did for 6 weeks, and then you go to nights, and then 6 more weeks, you're not just staying on nights or going to days, you're flipping the week. So your schedule has then now flipped. So you were working Sunday through Wednesday, now it's Wednesday through Saturday. And your entire life changes. Your sleep schedule changes, everything.
Yeah.
I just read, something not good for mental health, doom scrolling through Instagram, but there was a great psychology account that started to talk about the lack of sleep and what it does to you. It affects your brain negatively, cognitively. It negatively affects it, and then you suffer from depression and that kind of stuff. And I know I've seen that all through the community.
Yeah. So imagine that you're already sleep deprived. There's also studies that show that people that are sleep deprived tend to make ethical mistakes in their missions, whether police officers or military folks and things like that, right? And everyone can relate to this. Everyone's been tired, and you're not your best version of yourself. You're short with people, you're angry, you're grumpy, and you're like, all I just want to do is sleep. Well, imagine you're that way, and then you show up, and your job is to follow a person that you've been following for the last 2 years, watching him hug his children. And this day he moves away from his children, and you get to kill him. And then his children show up, and you watch the funeral, and then you go home at the end of the day that you've had just a horrible day that's super emotional. And you get home, and your wife hands you the colicky baby that she's been taking care of for the last 12 hours while you've been, screwing off at work. Right. So,
yeah, and that work conversation usually is what, she says, hey, how was your day at work? Well, what do you respond? No one responds with, I just killed a guy, and I'm struggling with that because everything is clandestine and through, secret means. And so you can't just go home and talk about it. And that's another issue, another mental health that I think needs to be solved. And so that's really what I loved about the book. And I do want to say, everybody, if you're listening to this and you haven't read the book, go get it. I did it as a audiobook, so Audible has it. It's in hardback. Is it in paperback as well?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Yeah. But that's it. I mean, hardback is the best way. I would tell everybody, read it, especially like me, if you're a history buff and also somebody that has dealt with mental health issues in this sort of remote killing. It deals with all of that. And please, everybody, read the book. And so we only have a few more minutes left. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I did want to ask if you have any thoughts on sort of the future of this warfare when we get into sort of an aerial denial and we can't fly in an area, but we still need drones to see things or to pick up signals and that kind of stuff. What do you see as the future?
Yeah, that's actually what I'm working on now for the next book is autonomous weapons or lethal autonomous weapon systems. They're called all kinds of different things, but basically think of a robot or a drone that can sense the environment, positively identify a target as a valid, legitimate military target, make the determination to engage the target on its own, and then take that action to, shoot or strike or employ something. All right. So that's the trend of where we're headed between artificial intelligence, sensing, autonomy, robotics. The United States says that we will always have a human on the loop, right? And on the loop means that the thing could be completely autonomous and the human is just out there watching and, can hit the pause button or the return home if something goes wrong, or can hit the yes button to actually engage something. What I think will occur is, out of operational necessity and out of strategic competition, we will have to, or we will be forced to employ autonomous weapons with a human completely out of the loop, or their point in the loop is at the very beginning where it says, here's your area to go to, here's your target sets. If you find any of these with high confidence, 90% or greater, determined by your onboard processing, then you can kill those targets and then report, come back and then report mission success.
Yeah, I'm sure no one has a negative opinion on that, huh? I've got to get that book.
I got to write it first.
Yeah, that intrigues me a lot.
Yeah. Well, so it's not just a one-sided argument too, because there's folks that say, look, think of self-driving cars. If you can make a self-driving car safer than, cars that are driven by humans, where we kill 30,000 people on the road every year, do we have a moral imperative to prevent people from killing each other on the road if we can reduce that? Say we reduced it by 90%. There's always going to be some sort of accidents, but if the car is safer than the human, or the machine is safer than the human, should we do that? Well, what if lethal autonomous weapons are more precise and can engage targets with less collateral damage? What if they don't commit war crimes? What if they're not tired? What if they're not angry? What if they're, et cetera, et cetera? All the things that make us human that also make us vulnerable to making mistakes. Machines aren't vulnerable that way. They're vulnerable in different ways.
Yeah, and I think the only issue I would say that people have talked to me about in this situation is who is to blame whenever this happens, because we as a society always need somebody to blame. That's probably why our politics are so bad these days. So we want to blame the other person. You can't blame a machine. What are you going to do? Shut it down?
No, you can't blame a machine, and you can't blame the engineer. You can't blame the algorithm developer. I think we have to get to the point where if that's the path we're going down, where the person that's accountable for actions on the battlefield is still the commander, just like they're responsible for their troops' actions on the battlefield now, not necessarily individual actions, but as a whole, right? So they set the conditions, they put them in the specific area, they tell them what you can engage and what you can't. I think you can still hold commanders accountable for that, which means that they're going to have a great understanding of how these systems are tested, what they're capable of doing, where they will most likely fail, where they're best employed, all of those things. So it's a whole new way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and it's a new rabbit hole to go down. So definitely going to have to get you back on, because we just do not have enough time to get through everything. Like I said before, we went down a path I wasn't expecting, but I thought it was important to get that message out, because I do think mental health is a very important part of remote killing. I'm glad you touch on it in the book. I highly recommend the book. It's a lot of pages, but it is a quick read because there is so much information that goes to it. So Wayne, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for providing just some great insights into remote killing and the mental.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been my pleasure, and thanks for having me on, and thanks for the engaging conversation. I'm always trying to get the word out about the struggles and challenges of our community.
We want to thank Mr. Wayne Phelps for joining our podcast. You can find his book on killing remotely, The Psychology of Killing with Drones, in both hardback and audio formats. This conversation centered around mental health issues of the drone community. Whether you are part of remote killing or have other mental health issues, please find a trusted mental health professional to speak with. If you are a veteran in need of immediate help, please contact the Veterans Crisis Hotline at 1-800-273-TALK or 8255.